Bingo. It's recording. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So
Okay.
now I've got to start streaming from here to Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if you just give me a second, I'll start that up.
Yep. Okay. It's very clever how he's done this.
Come on. Why has it not connected yet?
Oh.
What am I missing? One moment, please.
Okay. Thanks, Jackie.
Still waiting for a live video.
Oh, do you not have to go to the group?
I have.
Oh, right.
One moment. That's better.
Okay.
One moment. And there we go.
Fab. Okay. Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the first ever Fiction Fix Online. And with this being Halloween at the end of the month, we have a suitably spooky selection of offerings for you this afternoon. This event is being live streamed to the Finger on the Pulse, which is the Facebook group for Fiction Fix Live and Fiction Fix Online, and the video will be posted afterwards on YouTube on my Helen Gould channel. So please do subscribe and point all your friends to it. So at our Fiction Fix Live events, there's always a books table, and while we can't quite replicate that, we do have a chat facility. So please, authors, post. Excuse me. Okay, that's dealt with that. Sorry, I've just retired Yoda. So while we can't quite replicate that, we do have this chat facility on the side of the screen. So please, authors, do put your book details in there. And if you include a link to the ebook or the seller for the print version and the price, and an ISBN if you have it, and this can be done at the end, you know, or whenever you have a moment. So I'd also like to mention that Leanne Rogers was due to join us this afternoon, but she isn't able to, but sends her apologies, and hopefully she'll be able to read at Fiction Fix again soon. So now, to open the afternoon's delights, we have Colin with the start of a new fantasy series. He's not been wasting time in lockdown, so will you please put your hands together for Colin A. Brett and Theo. Right. Oh. Oh, Colin, you've muted.
I have unmuted now. Sorry about that.
Okay.
20 caravans were arranged in a wide, somewhat disordered circle around the forest clearing. Hetman O'Garrity's people were just rising for their regular morning routines of tending the horses, preparing breakfast, and checking the camp's perimeter. This activity was accompanied by the complaints, curses, and outright blasphemies about the freezing weather, iced over water buckets, and iron-hard ground. The girl watched from the far side of the encampment as the young man packed a rucksack. Of average height, he was slimly built with short, jet-black hair and, she knew, eyes of the richest, darkest brown. He moved with grace and precision, a fluidity she had seen in few of the gypsy men in the band. Although, of course, he was not wholly of gypsy blood, was he? Oh, Theo, she sighed. Theo Mistbourne was dressed in rough but functional clothes of heavy blue cotton. A travelling cloak and hat were laid to one side, ready for departure. Into the rucksack went spare clothing, flint and tinder, cutlery, and a small pan. These were all wrapped in the clothing to prevent rattling and sharp objects digging into his back. A bedding roll, wrapped in an oiled sheet, was strapped to the bottom of the rucksack. She watched him test the weight and comfort before laying the rucksack back on the ground and hefting another, smaller case. This had a rather round body and a long, slender neck. It was Theo's prized possession, his lute, which he played with consummate skill, and used to accompany many of the songs and stories he had collected on his travels with the gypsy band. What are you watching him for? The rough voice was instantly recognizable, as was the distaste the speaker had for Theo. The girl was rudely jolted from her heart-sick gazing. "Oh," she blurted, "Anders, I was just off to collect water." She held up the pail and smiled weakly. "The river's that away, Tess," Anders said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. You shouldn't be mooning over that puke when there's real menfolk in your family need their breakfast." Tessa Marie O'Garrity, daughter of the hetman, bridled at Anders' use of her nickname. His family was of lower standing within the band, and he should treat her with a little more respect. He was brutish, coarse, and not a little stupid, but Anders had the strength of a cart horse and, Tess had to admit, a bravery that her father admired. That allowed him to get away with his crude behavior even in front of her father. Tess swallowed her pride and turned towards the river. In his own rather blunt way, Anders was right, and she did have responsibilities to meet. She had walked barely 10 feet, however, when she heard Anders move off towards Theo, obviously intent on causing trouble. The pail hit the ground as Tess dropped it, spun on her heel, and dashed after Anders. "Where are you off to?" Anders growled. "Running away, Miss Moon?" Theo straightened as the bully approached. He could see Tessa Marie closing the distance, a worried frown on her face. "Anders, stop it," the girl called. She reached out her hand and placed it on Anders' right arm. Tess had seen how much damage he could do with that hand. "Stay out of this, Tess," snarled Anders as he snatched his arm from her grip. "This yellow dog's running away before the weather turns nasty, so he can say soft and warm, playing his little songs in the inns." Theo looked over Anders' shoulder into the worried eyes of Tessa Marie. He pointedly ignored the brute in front of him. "Headman O'Garrity has asked me to deliver a message to Mandel's band," Theo said calmly. "I'll be away 2 or 3 days, maybe. Should be back before the snow hits, hopefully." Anders smiled cruelly. "Well, then you're in trouble. There are wolf packs down from the hills, and goblins have been seen around here as well. And," he paused and his smile grew even more vicious, "they say elves are moving through here too." Tessa Marie gasped and her eyes widened in shock. "That's too much, Theo. I'll speak to father. We're supposed to be meeting Mandel in a few days. You don't need to risk yourself against—" Her voice trailed off as the superstitious awe in which the gypsies held the elven folk brought back all the old campfire tales. Elves could move almost silently and steal livestock, treasure, even children from under their parents' noses. Some were killers, assassins in the shadows, and their magics were said to be the blackest imaginable. "That's why the old man's sending this puke," Anders said with a laugh. "He's not really one of our people, is he? At least he's not a full-blood gypsy like you and me, Tess. Our band can afford to lose him." Anders finished with a sneer, as if Theo was something he'd trodden in. Theo saw the shock on Tessa Marie's face turn to anger. He knew her temper was almost as volatile as her father's, and sought to calm her. "He's sending me because at least I have the manners to speak with Hetman Mandel without getting a whipping for speaking out of turn." Theo had raked up ancient history with that remark. 10 years before, Anders had been beaten by Mandel's son for calling the hetman an old git. Anders well remembered that beating and the bruises and humiliation it had left him with. He snarled and in the blink of an eye balled his right fist and swung at Theo. "Don't!" shrieked Tessa Marie, a second too late. Theo blocked Anders' haymaker with his left arm and jabbed a punch at the other man's exposed stomach. It hit with a satisfying thump. It hit with a satisfying thump, but it felt like he had hit a steel breastplate rather than flesh, and it left his hand numb. He took a step back, narrowly dodging Anders' next anger-fueled swing, and suddenly Tessa Marie was between the two of them. "Stop it, both of you!" she yelled, but Anders did not heed her and stepped around the scared young woman and advanced on Theo, mayhem in mind. "Theodoric Mistmoon!" The voice, clear and calm but loud as a thunderclap, echoed around the camp. Anders was brought up short and Theo spun on the spot to see his mother standing on the steps of their caravan. "That's better," Sherilyn Mistmoon said, as the two men calmed and the girl placed herself firmly between them. "He started," Theo began, but his mother held up a hand for silence and was duly obeyed. "You two," Sherilyn said to Anders and Tessa Marie, "have tasks to perform for your families, do you not?" Tessa Marie nodded quickly and Anders grunted, still glaring at Theo. "Then I suggest you go about them, quickly and quietly." They turned and went their separate ways. Tessa Marie back to where she had dropped the pail, and Anders off on errands of his own. Theo caught the word "witch" as Anders stalked off past him. Theo looked up at his mother, who had not moved from the caravan steps. He felt ashamed that he had lost his temper and come to blow with Anders, but he was also relieved that his mother had saved him from the pounding he would surely have received. He shrugged, feeling helpless. "You finished packing?" Sherilyn inquired as she came down the steps and walked over to her son. Theo nodded. "Good. Then I have something for you." First, she produced a food parcel: bread, cheese, meat, and fruit. "This should see you through your first day," she said quite brightly, "after which you'll have to fend for yourself. Remember, do not eat any fruits you may find on the bushes. These are likely to be poisonous at this time of year, as it is Lady Varna's way of ensuring greedy men leave some food for the animals under her care." Theo nodded again at a lesson he had heard many times. "I will, Mother." Theo stopped in some surprise. His mother looked somehow older this morning, while undoubtedly still beautiful in his eyes, and the hot-eyed leching of some of the men folk in the camp. He was sure there were grey strands in her hair and lines around her eyes that had not been there the previous morning. Sherilyn examined her son's face. "He can see it," she thought. "The gift is there, but buried so deeply it can barely make itself heard to his heart and mind. But buried beneath what?" She took a deep breath, reached under her shawl, and brought out a slim, leather-covered wooden case. "You may also need this." Theo took the case, about 3 feet long and fastened with brass hinges and hasps. The leather looked newly polished. Indeed, it even smelled of lacquer and beeswax. His mother nodded, and Theo opened the case. Inside was a short sword, about 2.5 feet long from pommel to point. The steel blade was polished almost to a mirror shine, and the hilt was inlaid with bronze, copper, and silver filigree. Beside the sword lay a scabbard of leather and brass. Theo was not a warrior, and aside from playing with wooden swords as a child, he had never held a real weapon larger than a dagger in his life. He looked questioningly into his mother's eyes. "It was your father's," Sherilyn said simply. "He left it when he..." After an uncertain pause, during which the words "betrayed, deserted, abandoned" flashed through her mind, she finished, "left us. I suppose it is yours by birthright." "I hope you never have to use it," she did not say. And there you go, the introduction to Theo.
That sounds fantastic. Thanks, Colin. So please make some noise again for Colin Brett. Okay, so next up we have Mark, who loves writing poetry, but he also loves writing flash fiction, and especially if it's horror. So he's got a piece of flash fiction for us now. So please give it up for Mark Symmonds with Allotment.
Hi, thank you. The foul stench greeted the gardener as he opened the door of the shed on his 10-pole allotment. There, in front of him, was not a rusty shovel or rotting vegetation, but two partially decomposed bodies. The gardener turned away and vomited to the side of the shed. His heart raced as he fumbled for his phone to report the bodies to the police. Within minutes, two uniformed officers arrived at the scene, and the gardener directed them to the shed. They opened it and found nothing. The shed was empty. No smell, no bodies, not even a rusty shovel. The gardener looked with horror as they told him it was empty, and he must have been imagining it. The gardener returned to the shed, and indeed, there were no bodies, no smell. It had all disappeared. He set to weeding his allotment patch, in and out of the cabbages and the rhubarb. As he did, there was suddenly a slam of the shed door, and the sky turned black and cold. He looked around, but was the only one there. He carried on weeding, telling himself it was all in his imagination. After several hours, he returned to the shed to put his tools away and to grab a well-earned coffee from his tartan thermos. The shed door wouldn't open. He pulled and tugged at it, but nothing happened. The gardener turned and ran to his car, which was sitting just inside the high wrought iron gate, which was topped with barbed wire. He drove out of the allotment without stopping to close the gates. That night, he pondered the day's events and wondered if it was him going mad. He decided if it happened again, he'd go and see the doctor. Although he hoped he was not going mad, but then hoped the events of that day were not true either. Following day, he returned to his allotment. He tried the shed again. This time it opened. He slowly pulled back the door, afraid of what he would see. Nothing. Just a few tools he had left there. He put the rest of his equipment from the boot of his car into the shed. It took the gardener several hours to finish clearing the rest of the weeds and pull up some veg to take home for dinner that evening. He wanted to sow some veg that would give a late crop, so he stayed long after the other allotment holders had gone home. He dug over a patch of soil, and as he inserted the shovel, just below the surface, it hit something hard. The gardener dug around the hard object. It was about 6 feet long, had a brass plaque on the front. As he cleared the soil away, he could see the name on the plaque. It was his name. He felt a shudder go down his spine, and his heart missed a beat as he realised that what he had discovered was a black coffin. He hauled it out of the ground and returned to the shed to get a crowbar. He prized open the lid. Inside, it was empty. He couldn't understand how the coffin had got there and why it had his name on it. The sky had started to blacken, and he retreated to the shed until he could decide what to do with the black lacquered coffin. Once inside the shed, he switched on the kettle and picked up his paper. There, on the third page of the paper, was a story of a man's mutilated body being found in a black lacquered coffin in an allotment. The gardener went cold, then felt the presence in the shed with him. He looked around the 8x12 shed, but no one was there. He went to the door, which then slammed in front of him, trapping him with the doombringer. He reached for his mobile phone, but it was knocked out of his hand. He froze. He tried to shout, but could feel his throat constricting. He struggled with the presence, trying to get it off of him. It was to no avail. He was starting to lose consciousness. Then the strangulation stopped. He sat on the floor for a couple of minutes, trying to recover what little breath he could muster. Then, out of nowhere, the spade lifted off the ground and came crashing down on his legs, then repeatedly hit him about the body. As he lay on the floor in a state of semi-consciousness, he heard the scraping of metal on a wooden floor. Then pain in his leg as the fork came crashing down into his thigh, rupturing blood vessels as it entered his muscular leg, then pulling it back out. As it retracted, the gardener gave a loud grunt. The fork came crashing back down, this time shattering his rib cage as it penetrated from front to back, causing massive internal bleeding. His life slowly ebbing away. The final fork blow cracked through his skull, sinking deep into his brain. He was finally dead. The spirit removed the fork and put the gardener in the coffin and buried it again, where it had been found. Days passed before the gardener was missed. The police searched the allotments. They found no sign that he had ever been there. They excavated the area where the gardener had been digging and found not a trace of him. A week later, a new tenant arrived at the allotment. Having heard the tale of the previous gardener, he refused to believe it. Then, one evening, as he was working alone, digging his patch, he struck something hard. He cleared the soil to reveal a black coffin with his name on it. He started to shudder and retreated to his shed. Standing in the corner of the shed was the previous gardener with a spade in his hand. 2 days later, the police arrived again at the allotment. Thank you. Helen, you need to unmute. You're muted, Helen.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. I used to have an allotment, and but I never had anything like that happen to me, but I did get robbed up there, so you know, you have to be a bit careful. Right, okay, so now thank you very much, Mark, that was great. So now on to one of our regular readers, J.S. Watts. And back in the early spring, just before lockdown, her latest novel was published. It's the sequel to Witchlight, and it's entitled Old Light. So she's going to read an excerpt from it. So let's have a warm welcome back for J.S. Watts.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be back at Fiction Fix, thank you, because as Helen said, I think I was at the last real live Fiction Fix before lockdown. My book, Old Light, came out at the end of February, so I was at the beginning of the March Fiction Fix, and then of course, well, we know what happened thereafter. So it's great to be at the first online version. So I'm going to read a little bit from Old Light. But I'm conscious I've read the opening chapters several times, so I'm actually going to pick a chapter from the middle of the book and give you some excerpts from that. Very briefly, give you a flavour of the whole series that Helen's alluded to. The first book in the series, Witchlight, traces the experience of Holly Jeps, as she is then called, who discovers at the rather late age of almost 40 that she's a witch. And with some rather spectacular powers. Old Light picks up about a year after that and continues with Holly's story. She's now known as Holly Beldam. She's taken the family name. She's a very powerful witch, but she's experiencing problems with the Coven, which is the governing body of witches in the UK. She finds them antiquated, reactionary, and very bureaucratic. So you need to be aware of that. You also need to be aware that Jake, her partner, who's a vet, and Holly have hit a rough time in their relationship. Jake is struggling to come to terms with Holly's special powers, and things have not gone well. And indeed, just before the chapter begins, Holly and Jake have had a very, very big bust up, and Jake stormed out. Holly hadn't had much sleep. Thoughts had been racing through her head all night, none of them pleasant. She'd sensed that things were uncomfortable between her and Jake, but not that uncomfortable, not potentially terminal. What had happened? What could she have done? Should she have done to prevent this? How could she get things back on an even keel? Could she use old magic to get him back, or would that just make things worse? Holly stretched across the empty bed towards her bedside table, held out her hand, and her mobile phone appeared in it, already dialing Jake's number. It rang, but he didn't answer. She rang again, and a third time, but all she heard each time was, "Hello, you've reached the answer phone of Jake Wortham. Please leave your name and number, and I'll get back to you. If it's an urgent issue requiring a vet, please ring the practice on..." If she hadn't known it already, she could have recited the surgery number from memory by the end of the third call. Holly lay back down and managed to doze off again for an hour, or maybe just a few moments. She didn't know which and didn't check the time, just reached for her phone and tried calling Jake again and again with exactly the same results. The light through her drawn bedroom curtain started to lighten ever so slightly as dawn sluggishly began to glimmer into day. Holly hadn't heard footsteps or a car engine, but suddenly there was a loud knocking on her front door. Holly's green silk dressing gown immediately appeared around her, and she was rushing downstairs to throw open the door, but it wasn't Jake. Standing on her doorstep was a grey-suited brother Wainthorpe, accompanied by brother Lincoln, also in the ubiquitous grey suit, and a tall, unknown man in a black, hooded, ankle-length robe. Given the amazingly inappropriate medieval garb, Holly assumed he was a coven old elder whom she hadn't previously met. "Good morning, Sister Beldam. It is almost morning, I believe. May we come in?" It was the robed man who spoke. His voice was deep, slow, and accentless. Holly was badly wrong-footed. Firstly, the incongruous trio outside her front door were not Jake. Secondly, they were not Jake. And finally, they were not Jake. In between, Holly was conscious that 3 coven officials were now outside her mundane Cambridgeshire home, and one was prepared to be seen in public looking like something from the medieval Grand Inquisition. Up until now, she had never seen witches try to look anything but contemporary in public, whatever they might choose to wear in the privacy of coven gatherings. Temporal distance aside, Holly realised she needed to take control of this situation, or as much control as she could manage given the circumstances. "No, gentlemen, I don't wish to seem unduly rude, but I'm not prepared to invite you into what is basically a mundane home. My partner..." Holly hesitated for a second, but struggled on, "is not a witch, and I try to keep this house as clear of magic and witchcraft as possible. If you wish, you may accompany me to my official address as formally registered with the coven. I am, I must admit, more than a little perturbed that you have chosen to call here and not there in the first place." "Indeed, Sister Beldam," it was the black-robed man who was once again talking, "but I'm afraid we are here on a matter of some weight and could not afford to delay matters because of blind adherence to protocol." "Ooh, it must be important for a coven elder to be turning up in person at this time in the..." Holly appeared towards the horizon, pre-dawn, "and ignore protocol." "I would assure you, sister, it is." So we'll cut a little bit out. They make their way to the Oxfordshire cottage that is Holly's official residence, not particularly amicably, but they get there, and rather frostily move into the lounge. Holly was about to offer everyone a cup of English breakfast tea when Elder Nightingale peremptorily said, "I think we can afford to dispense with trifling matters of etiquette. We are here to discuss the murder of Brother William James and your part in it." Holly was taken aback by the directness of his speech and the implications of its accusatory tone, but she responded no less directly. Gentlemen, as saddened as I am by the untimely death of anyone, I must take exception to the accusation that I was in some way involved in Brother James's demise. As I have repeatedly told you, and as I'm apparently going to have to do so again, the last I saw of Brother James was his retreating back as he exited via the selfsame front door you have just come in by. He was very much alive at the time. Yes, so you say, it was Elder Nightingale again, but by your own admission, he was last seen here in Oxfordshire with you, and then elements of him turn up in the field behind your Cambridgeshire house. The link between these two disparate locations, Sister Beldam, is you, and only you. Holly's tone grew markedly frostier. I have gone over all of this before with brothers Wainthorpe and Lincoln. I was not involved in his disappearance or death. I have no idea why he was in Basingfield, and I should very much like to know what he was doing there, and why, apparently, he was intercepting my post. Elder Nightingale's expression did not change. It was Brother Wainthorpe who snorted and said, "Post? Why would a witch bother with post? As for interfering with yours, this is the first I've heard of it." Holly opened her mouth to respond, but Elder Nightingale was quicker. "Hush now, Brother Wainthorpe. I'm sure all will become clear very shortly. This is just a further reason why we need to convene a truth council under the auspices of the Clerahorn. Don't you think?" There was a smugness to his comment that Holly didn't like. She was also surprised at her unexpected feeling of revulsion at the mention of the Clerahorn. It was not as if she even knew what a Clerahorn was, so there was no point in getting upset about it. But then she realised she did know what a Clerahorn was. The information she had harvested from the library was waiting patiently to tell her. The unexplained feeling of revulsion gave way to an all too understandable sense of nausea. A Clerahorn? You have got to be joking. There hasn't been a Clerahorn for over 300 years. And even if there was a witch with all the requisite abilities, who in their right mind would want to resurrect such a medieval and basically barbaric process? You cannot be serious about this. You are mistaken, Sister Beldam. The last Clerahorn was conducted less than 100 years ago at a time of great need for both the coven and the country. We feel we have need of the ritual again. A witch with your raw command of old magic would run circles around a standard coven inquiry unless you are controlled in some way. Indeed, I suspect that you have been willfully circuitous in your answers to the coven for some time. So I really think that a little order and control is now called for. That's all the Clerahorn is, you know. A short-term control mechanism for your witchlight. A temporary shackle for your power. Temporary, that is, unless you are found guilty. Holly had grown pale from both anger and a growing sense of panic. It's more than a shackle. I know that, and you must too. It's a temporary torture until I am found guilty, or it all goes horribly wrong, which it has been known to do more than once, in which case it's goodbye temporary. There is no way I'm going to agree to submit myself to such a thing. By now, Nightingale was ignoring the other two coven officials within the room. His focus was directed entirely on Holly. I must admit, I had anticipated your reluctance. That is why I've invited a certain someone to assist us in the process. It is a someone known to you, whom you trust implicitly, which must be a reassurance. No? I am also assuming that it is someone you would not wish to see harmed in any way. If you would care to accompany us to the High Hall of the Coven, you will find Mr. Jake Wortham is already there and waiting for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So please show your appreciation for Joyce Watts and Old Lights.
Thank you very much.
Sounds a very circuitous plot there, Judy.
It is the middle of the book.
Yeah, sure, no. I mean, every time I hear one of your readings, I think, oh, I must read that book. But
You must. It's a really good book.
I want to. Yeah, definitely. Right. So now we come to our newest reader, Sue, who has a spooky tale for you. So a big hand, please, for Sue E. Dale and her short story, Retribution.
Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Actually, this is the first chapter of my first book. So it's just, that's all right. So here goes. It was the Friday after Guy Fawkes night. The roads still interspersed with rocket casings and dead sparklers. Guys remained in wheelbarrows, their owners reluctant to part with them. Thick fog rolled in from the river, travelling stealthily between rows of terraced houses with their cracked, narrow steps leading down to their basements, their curtains closed. In the stillness, the pub doors opened, letting out the light, the sound of the jukebox, and ribald customers whose voices echoed across the road as they disappeared into the fog. Jack, waiting for his brother Sam, stood beside the majestic Victorian gates at the top of the road, or the bottom, depending on your point of view and where you live. He hoped he wouldn't be long. Sam did an evening paper round and was often delayed, tying up the unsold newspapers ready for collection the next day. Sam had forgotten his coat and was cold. He had texted Jack earlier, asking him to call home and collect it for him. He did hope that Mum wouldn't interrogate him as to where he was going and why he didn't want tea. He had told Mum he was meeting friends and was going for a McDonald's. He just hoped that Sam's usual cheery grunt would be sufficient. Stamping his feet on the ground and wrapping his arms around his chest and hands through his cuffs, he gazed into the distance. Everywhere looked different in the fog. It felt cold and creepy. Why tonight of all nights? Was that a bicycle lamp he could see? Recognizing Sam's fluorescent orange peaked cap, he was relieved to see him cycling up the hill. Apart from his cap, he was almost unrecognizable with his black scarf and black puffer jacket. "What's your mate?" puffed Sam as he dismounted his bike. "Fancy leaving your coat at home. Mum wanted to know why I didn't want tea, why I'd got your coat, where I was going, blah, blah, blah. I told her we were meeting up and I wasn't hungry. Hopefully she believed me." "Well, we have met up," replied Jack, his voice muffled as he wrapped the scarf Sam had also retrieved around his neck and mouth. "Well, it's not strictly true. I am hungry." "Well, I told Mum I was having a McDonald's, so maybe afterwards." Sam decided to say no more. He just wanted to get this so-called adventure over with. Why Jack wanted to do this, he had no idea. He was very fond of his big brother and was happy to support him through any of his crazy notions. He was hardly his big brother, as there was only a year between them. Poor Mum, she'd had her hands full. They were now aged 15 and nearly 6 feet tall. They had both taken after their father, tall, dark-haired, and with blue eyes. They had what their mother called open, generous faces, a ready smile and impish personalities. Jack the more so, whereas Sam was more serious and academic. They both adored their mother, neither liking to lie to her, especially Sam, who often noticed how tired she looked and felt she deserved a bit of TLC. Dad no longer lived with them. The boys didn't know all the details, but gathered that Dad had met a younger woman in the pub. When their mother found out, she gave Dad the ultimatum, her or me. Dad had chosen her. Mum and Dad were still in touch. The boys had regular contact, and on birthdays or any other celebratory event, he would always be there. Although Jack didn't say anything, he found it hard. After 5 years, he still missed his dad and wished he'd come home. Walking together towards the gates, Jack was wondering why he thought this would be fun. He no longer felt so brave. Not wanting to lose face and hoping he sounded confident, he whispered, "Knew it would work." Sam wished he hadn't agreed to come. "What's worked?" "The gates, they're open. I knew if I gave Pete a $5, he'd leave them open. He's a greedy bugger, he wanted a $10." Pete, Jack's 16-year-old mate, had left school to work at the cemetery. He didn't have much confidence, so rather than take any exams, he'd started job hunting. His grandfather, who worked at the council, had heard of the vacancy and got him a job at the cemetery. Nice and close to home, just across the road from Jack and his mates. Pete thought this was perfect, without wondering if this was the job for him. He helped to dig the graves, cut the grass, empty the flour and rubbish bins, and was relied upon to lock up at night. Sam wondered what his brother would think if he knew he'd have wanted more than a tenner to put his job on the line. Sometimes he thought Pete was a bit sick and would do anything for a quick buck. The large black gates, generally closed at 6 p.m, stood ajar. Jack and Sam had lived in this road all their lives. These gates and the surrounding railings, which children often attempted to climb, didn't look so inviting with the fog twirling through the ironwork. The boys, each wishing the other would bottle out, slipped between the gates. Sam hid his bike behind a gravestone. "Turn your torch on, Jack. I can barely see the path." "The batteries are dead. I've got my mobile." "Oh, Jesus," muttered a horrified Sam, who thought this choice of words very apt. "What percentage is left?" Jack, who was never very good at maths, confidently laughed. "Oh, 15%. We'll be fine." Sam, who had been convinced his big brother would bring a torch, hadn't charged his mobile either. "Mine's on 65%. Turn yours off. We'll use yours later. I'm sure this fog is getting thicker." They headed along the tarmac path towards the church. The path led to a roundabout outside the Lich Gate, perfect for bridal cars and hearses. Looking over the Lich Gate wall, the ancient church looked daunting as its tower and lopsided weather vane disappeared into the fog. In daylight, the shingle path with its dandelions, lichen and goosegrass twisted invitingly from the church doorway through the oak Lich Gate towards the cemetery. It was a beautiful Gothic church, well loved by the locals. No one knew why the church had iron gates and a Lich Gate. Locals' opinions differed. Some thought it was to keep grave robbers out, while others thought it was to keep the dead in. Belt and braces were the nicknames given to the church. The tarmac drive narrowed, becoming a path dwindling down to paving slabs and then grass. It was a large graveyard dating back over 300 years. A previous church rector, Reverend Boxford, a kind, understanding man, had dedicated an area at the back of the graveyard for young and stillborn babies. In tragic circumstances, mother and baby could be buried together or close by. Unfortunately, he had left the parish quickly, leaving no explanation. Some locals said they had not been well. Others, who believed they had seen him in the town nearby, said he appeared as if he had had a stroke. No one really knew, only that he chose to keep himself to himself. The lamp over the church doorway shone towards the Lich Gate, leaving a glow on the damp tarmac. It reminded Jack of the goths that hung around the town centre, black, their only glow from their cigarettes. Moths flew around the church light whilst bats hung in the Lich Gate. The boys were fond of the Lich Gate and always thought of it as the gateway to heaven. Odd how different it looked that night. Jack and Sam hesitated. Sam decided that now was not the time to be brave. "Jack," his voice muffled by his scarf and hooded jacket, "I don't like this. Can we go home?" "No, let's stay. I can't afford to pay Pete another $5. There's no one here. There never is. It's just the fog making us feel funny. I'll hold your hand if you like." Sam thought that this was a perfect idea, but not willing to look a sissy, tried to sound shocked. "No way. What do you think I am? Unless, of course, you want me to hold yours." "You must be joking. Come on, let's follow the path. It's the grave at the end by the hedge." Inwardly, both boys were wishing they were girls. Girls could hold hands and no one made a comment. "Oi, Jack, don't shove," said Sam, as his brother, slipping on the damp paving slab, clutched hold of him. Sam, realising that Jack wasn't letting go, used this as an excuse to hold on to him. It wasn't until much later that they separated. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well done, Sue, because it's not easy to do that. So let's hear it again for Sue Edale and Retribution.
Thank you.
So you're building up the tension nicely there. Right. Okay, so now we're coming to the end of this afternoon's entertainment, so it just remains for me to bring you a snippet from the latest book that I've been working on over the last few months. There's still some work to do on it, so this may not be the final version, but I haven't been idle myself throughout lockdown. So here are a couple of themes from the beginning of the Zarduth Imperative Flagship. Okay. The White House, Washington, 19th of November, 2091. What? The Zarduthi children have taken their ship back, Space Station Commander Melville repeated. President Baryshnikov drew in a deep breath. It wasn't that he hadn't expected this, knowing how desperate Ayar de Kutz was to find his father. He just hadn't expected it to happen so soon. What's more, a number of humans have gone with them, mostly willingly, one apparently not. Who? Hardy Brencher. My security chief for that project, the president wailed. De Kutz made a particular plea on his behalf, Melville added. He said it hadn't been Brencher's intention to leave with them. He just went on board to talk them out of it. But they didn't know he was there, so the ship left the station before he could disembark. All right, this is what we'll do. I'll send out a pursuit force. I need that ship back for when these Voth things come here. But the other ships are only half ready, and you won't catch them with anything else. The drive is installed and has been tested in 3 ships, Baryshnikov retorted. They just need prettying up. I'll get crews up there double quick. All you need to do is give the fleet clearance to leave. So this is a little bit later in chapter 1, where some shooting classes have been set up on board the ship. So the location is the Bakel, the shooting gallery. Ship's time, 403.374.7.58.949 after departure. Crack! Hardy checked the target. Devan had hit it dead on again. Excellent, Devan, he acknowledged, and gave the nod to Mill to fire. He stepped forwards and adjusted his position. A tongue of bluish flame arced out from his disruptor to sear the bottom right quarter of the target. Well done, Mill. That's enough to kill either a person or a Voth. Mill nodded. Jaffer. He stepped into position, feet braced apart. Disruptor gripped in both hands, raised it and slowly took aim. Hardy approved of the way he took his time so as to be sure of a hit. He waited until Jaffa was positioned well before giving his signal. Instantly, the flame snaked out and charred the centre of the target. Well done, Jaffa. Of course, Jaffa and Devan had had weapons training with JSET, but it was good to see that it helped. And Josie and Edith haven't had the benefit of it, as they were civilian employees of JSET, he thought. Josie was next. She hadn't been happy at the prospect of learning to use the disruptor, and Hardy wasn't sure whether it was because she didn't like the idea of using weapons or because he was the instructor. Just look on it as another form of self-defense, he'd told her at the start of the session. Now, he said, okay, Josie, get yourself ready and fire when you're comfortable. He watched her move into position. The weapon wavered in her grasp. Not a good sign, but they still had some time. That was just as well, although he'd pointed out that she might never have to use a disruptor. Privately, he was certain it would come to that at some point. Ready? As ready as I'll ever be, Josie murmured. Okay, fire. And she did. The target remained untouched. Okay, everyone, another round and we finish. Take your time. The first in line was Azad. He'd quickly picked up the basics and was an excellent shot. Another target sizzled. Excuse me a minute. Kaskuf shot next. She was good too. Hardy had no worries about any of the Zarduthi, but he was concerned about Josie. At the end of the round, he called out, okay, thanks everyone. You've all worked very hard. He looked directly at Josie as he spoke, because he wanted to include her too for encouragement. Practice sessions are available tonight from 8 thousandths on. Anyone's welcome, but they're on a first come, first served basis, no more than 6 at a time. See you later. Quickly, he crossed to Josie. Wait, he said. I need to talk to you before the next group come in. Josie's fingers were twisted around the grip of the weapon. She turned the power up switch to off before handing it to him. I can't do this, she said, without looking at him. Her voice was low and hopeless. You can, Josie. We just have to find the best way to help you. He put a hand under her chin and turned her face up to his. Please don't be upset about it. That won't help. I know. The words squeezed out from deep inside her. But not being able to do it makes me feel bad inside. I feel such a failure in front of all the children. Look, they're bred to this, and people like me spend a long time learning to do it. It doesn't come naturally to everyone. Why not come to the practice session this evening? I just prefer not to have to miss the target every time in company with children I used to look after. Hardy went to put an arm around her shoulders, then stopped himself and let his arm fall. I understand that, he said. I'll give you some private tuition if you want. I'd rather not learn this at all. I understand that too, but I'm concerned that you may not be able to defend yourself if necessary. Josie looked up at him. I suppose I am too, but I don't know what I can do about it. I just can't seem to aim right. Hardy walked over to the rows of seats lining the room and sat down, beckoning to her. If you mean that beam weapons are harder to use than a projectile weapon, I'd be inclined to agree with you. I think maybe I do mean that. All right, he said flatly. We'll start with a projectile gun. He pulled a small weapon out of a concealed breast pocket. Here, try this for size. He was pleased to note that the first thing she did as he placed it on the palm of her hand was to locate and check the safety catch was on. Then he watched as she hefted it. This is yours? Yes. If you can get on with it, you can have it. You'd give me a gun. Josie, I'd give you anything if I could know you'd be able to defend yourself. But remember, the Voth are unaffected by projectile weapons. You might never have to use a disruptor, but you need to know how to. I'm certain it'll come to that at some point, he thought. She nodded, regarding his leather jerkin speculatively rather than meeting his eyes. Come here at 9,000ths tonight, and I'll spend some time with just you. I'm going to get you shooting efficiently, however long it takes. I run a survival class. Thank you so much. Thank you. You're all muted. Thank you so much. We will get used to that, I think, at some time. So, thank you, Colin, for being the techie guy, and all the lovely readers, Colin, Jackie, Mark and Sue, for joining me. Authors, please don't forget to include your links to your books on Kindle and so on in the chat, and I'll post them on my timeline and anywhere else that I can do that. And, oh yes, last little notice. The next Fiction Fix Online is on Sunday the 6th of November at 4 p.m. till 5 p.m, as it was tonight. And I look forward to catching up with you then. This has been Helen Claire Gould comparing Fiction Fix Online for the very first time. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for watching, everybody. Cheers. Thank you. Just stop the recording. Stop recording.